Hello and welcome to our podcast here at Manor Park Classics. I'm on my own again today, and I'd like to take a bit of time to talk about something that I touched upon in our last podcast and also the first one that I hosted, the one in which we talked about Jaguar and the one where I had Tim beside me to just talk utter bobbins about classic cars. And that's the idea of really usable classic cars and about potentially even dailying those classic cars, because it's something I've done. It's something I've thoroughly enjoyed doing, and though I'm not doing it right at this moment, though, well, it depends on definitions. Maybe I am, if you think the car that I'm driving every day is a classic car. Who knows? Each to their own. But I want to talk about classic dailies today, and we have a raft of cars coming through our auctions here at Manor Park that are absolutely the kinds of cars that I personally would love to drive every day. I would absolutely trust them and use them in my normal everyday transport. Might not be perfect for everyone. Everyone has their own tastes as well. So what might float my boat might not necessarily yours. But we'll go through some of the choices today. Go through some of the lots that have sold in our December auction, and talk about how some of them may stand up towards more modern cars, because classic cars nowadays, they are so much more capable than many people give them credit for. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, I first mentioned this idea of really usable classic cars in the Jaguar podcast earlier on, but the thing we need to get clear straight away is what constitutes a classic car. Because, of course, everybody is going to have a different definition of a classic based on your age, your background, your taste in cars as well. Everyone is going to have a slightly different perspective. So I sit here recording this podcast at the end of 2024. May well be 2025 by the time you all see this. But for me, it's December 2024. And what do we count as a classic car? Where does something become a classic? Is it based purely on age? Or is it based on a car's provenance as well? Because if it is based on age, then where do we draw that line? And when we do draw that line, what about some of the really important cars that have come out since, or the cars that were in production in that time period? How can we level with those being classic cars when maybe some others that may be more deserving aren't? So I've got a few notes written down here of just cars that just snapped into my head. Cars that I thought, could we describe these as classics? So the first one is the F87 BMW M2. Sounds like a bit of a strange choice to make, but the reason I do it is because the production on that car ended in 2021. It's only 3 years ago. It's virtually a modern car. 3 years ago, you could go into your BMW dealer and buy one. So is that car a classic now? I don't think many people would refer to it as a classic, but from a provenance perspective, the BMW M2, when it was launched in 2016, just had an overwhelming bout of attention placed upon it, and it got a heck of a lot of praise as well. People really loved that BMW M2 when it was launched. A lot of motoring journalists said that this is what a BMW M car should be. It was compact, it was good looking, it had a great straight-six engine, rear-wheel drive, and was available with a manual gearbox. And as BMW are changing now, as that kind of thing isn't quite so forthcoming anymore, is the F87 a classic? Or at what point will it become a classic? So if we don't refer to the F87 M2 as a classic car, and totally understandable why you might not, can we instead refer to its predecessor, the E82 BMW 1M Coupe? Could we classify that as a classic car? Because if the provenance of the M2 isn't quite enough, then will that little bit of extra age, being that little bit older, but also will all the awards that car won? In 2011, the 1M Coupe was Evo and Top Gear Car of the Year, and they only produced 6,309. So that is a rare car with a lot of provenance, the style of which we don't really see that much of anymore. So is it a classic? If so, then absolutely fine, but if not, again, where do we draw that line? Is there some kind of age signifier that takes a car away from being a relatively modern car and really pushes it into that classic status? Who knows? You tell me. But I'm of the view that those two cars could be described as classic cars, in which case describing them as great classic dailies is a bit of a rubbish exercise anyway, because they are next to modern cars. You know, even the 1M Coupe is 10 years newer than the car I drive every day. So what I'm saying is everybody's definition of classic is different. Everybody's definition of classic is stretched by someone else's. And so I don't want us all to be too critical. I don't want us all to be thinking, oh, this isn't a classic, or for whatever reason, because to someone it is. To someone else it might not be, and that's fine. Let's just move on. Let's all just be nice to each other, hey? So I do think, however, that our definition of a classic car hasn't changed with the times quite enough. So there's no doubt that cars last a lot longer than they used to. That is part of the reason why our perspective of classic cars has stayed with quite a lot, more elderly cars, and it's not maybe extending to some of the more modern stuff. But in doing a little bit of hunting around in preparation for this podcast, I've gone and looked at old issues of Practical Classics magazine. Now, I mentioned these in the last podcast I did with Tim, just because it kind of came up naturally in the conversation. But in the second ever issue of Practical Classics magazine from 1980, they had a story about the MGB advertised on its cover. I think it was something to do with replacing the sills on one. But in the middle of 1980, when that magazine was published, the MGB was still in production. Sure, it had been around for 18 years, understandable, but still, 18 years today would only take us to 2006. Or, by the time you presumably watched this, 2007. A car, going into production in that date. And so, by our perspective, that's a very modern car. And yet, in only the second issue of Practical Classics, that was considered a practical classic, something that is relatively affordable, that is very usable, that is relatively dependable as well, that you could use. That's why I reference Practical Classics in this context of potential classic daily drivers, because they are the arbiters. Practical Classics, it does what it says on the tin. Now, in issue 5 of Practical Classics magazine, again in 1980, they had a picture, not just a little link to a story, a full picture of an Austin Healey Sprite on the cover. Now, the Austin Healey Sprite was no longer in production, but its badge-engineered cousin, should I say, the MG Midget, very much was in production. Just as the MGB was, they stopped being built together, and so in those first 5 issues of Practical Classics, I don't know the others, I've not sifted through all of them, so I can't say. These are just a couple that I came across. They have cars that are still being built as classic cars. It's just really interesting to see. And then we move on a number of years forwards, and in an issue from 1988, there is a Mark II Escort on the cover. Now, a Mark II Ford Escort by this point had only been out of production for 8 years. And that means that as of next year, we would be looking at cars, from 2017 that were, that went out of production in that year. And so a year later, in 2018, we saw the end of the Mark III Focus. That was the last generation where they did a Focus RS. But in 2017, we lost the likes of the Citroen C3 Picasso, Ford B-Max, the Skoda Yeti, and the Volkswagen Scirocco. Only the latter 2 of those, but none of them really, are being described by anyone as a classic car. And I'd say that's for a few reasons. First of all, cars last much longer nowadays than they used to, and so our definition of classic stays a little bit more stationary than maybe it would have done in the past. But maybe, with the context of how classic cars used to be perceived in the 1980s, maybe we need to start looking at more modern things a little bit more closely. But that is a little bit of an aside, really. I understand why that's not really necessary to talk about when we're starting talking about real classic daily cars that are not very common anymore, cars that, that we would not consider normal, everyday, viable daily drivers, which actually might be. I just wanted to stick it in there at the front because it's such an interesting study of our perception of these cars, etc. So I have up on my laptop screen here a a list of cars that went through our auction here at Manor Park Classics in December. So it's only a couple of weeks ago as of recording. And as of recording, again, we're in that lull between auctions where not all the cars are being collected yet that have been sold. Their new owners haven't yet come to pick them up. And we've only got a very small handful of new lots incoming for our February auction. So we haven't got a vast array of cars to try and coax you into potentially bidding on, but we could just look at some of our previous auctions, look at the results as well, and look at why these may or may not be suitable daily cars. So I'm starting towards the top end of our sales here. We go down a little bit from some of the more high-value cars, some of the older cars, some of the rarer cars, some of the things you might not necessarily want to drive every day. And we come to what was lot 53 in our December auction. In fact, it's still in the building. You won't be able to see it, of course. It's somewhere beyond the wall to my left. And it was a 1989 Range Rover Vogue SE. A really quite nice example of the Range Rover Classic, which has had a few little bits tinkered with it. It presents in generally original condition, but under the bonnet, for example, it has a 4.5-litre version of the Rover V8. Of course, as standard, the Range Rover Classics came as either a 3.5-litre or later a 3.9-litre, but this one has a 4.5-litre engine, and it's only got 59,000 miles. Now, the original Range Rover was designed in the 1960s and was launched in 1970, but lasted all the way through to 1996. It was essentially replaced in 1994 by the P38 Range Rover, but they lasted so long on the market because they were such... they were absolute technical tour de forces. There were very few of the permanent four-wheel drive cars in the world in that period that really stood up to the standard of the Range Rover. And that means that even today, 30-odd years after it's gone out of production and nearly 55 years after its launch, it still stands up as a pretty usable everyday car. Of course, you get that lovely sonorous thrum of the Rover V8 coming in front of you. You get the you get the ability that four-wheel drive brings you, and you get a really classless car. You get a car that hasn't really aged stylistically. It still presents so brilliantly well. This particular example has the famous 3-spoke alloy wheels, which are in body colour, a nice dark blue. In fact, I'm just reading it here, Caspian blue apparently is the shade, and Winchester grey interior. And this is a 35-year-old car as of the end of 2024, and it has an automatic transmission. It has leather seats. It has electrically adjustable seats. It has a heck of a lot of equipment for a car, considered to be so old. And something like this, if you've got the kind of budget to buy it, of course, but also then to maintain it and to keep it in that nice condition, and also pay for the fuel for the 4.5-litre V8 engine. Let's be honest, we're not going to beat around the bush here. This is something that is out of budget for many, many people. But there's no reason why one of these couldn't be driven every day, because they are so refined still. Rover, Land Rover, Rover Group, British Leyland, whatever they call themselves that week, they did a phenomenal job of taking the original Range Rover, which was half farm vehicle, half family saloon, and they slowly built it into a traditional Rover, in that it was overtly luxury facing. For many, many years, Land Rover and Range Rover were not that. They were, first and foremost, they were utility vehicles, but over the years they became more like normal Rover saloons. And something like this, a 1989 Vogue SE, it's just such a usable thing if you have the space, if you have the money to maintain it, for example. That car sold, by the way, for £17,250, which was something of such provenance as the original Range Rover. In that kind of condition, with those choice modifications, with only 59,000 miles, it would be out of budget for me. It's not something I could personally go out and buy right now, at all, by any stretch of the imagination. But if you have that kind of money, I think it's a bit of a bargain still. We then move to something that is much less luxury and into the sports car market, and we have Lot 76, a 1988 Porsche 944 900S. This is the 16-valve model that isn't the most loved of 944s, I have to be honest. But this example, again, only has 53,000 miles and is sold for £13,300. Now, again, I understand why this might be out of budget for many people, or you may not want to take on the preservation of a vehicle like this, especially if you're going to be driving it every day. We're starting more at the top of the tree here, as I said earlier. But this has no advisories on its MOT. It presents beautifully in that very 1980s white. I will not say anything about the connotations of 1980s white cars, but it's there and it's cool, as far as I'm concerned. And it has this wonderful aubergine-style interior. It is so period correct. But the 944s, they were such sophisticated cars. Proper Porsche engine. It's only got 4 cylinders, but it has 16 valves. Dual overhead camshafts. It's a very reliable little engine in these cars. 2.5 litres, of course. And you've got a rear-mounted transaxle, which means you get great weight distribution. Brilliant suspension on these. These drive like a much more modern car than maybe their 1970s ancestry would say. So this car is on a D registration, 1988, and I see absolutely no reason, if you don't have the need to carry around rear seat passengers, if you don't need all that much luggage space, maybe you're living on your own, or just you and your partner are together and you've not got any children to deal with, maybe they've left home, or maybe you haven't got any children, whatever. That, I think, is a fantastic choice. You couldn't really support a family with it. It's too small. Get the Range Rover for doing that. But it just presents really nicely. It's had quite a lot of money spent on it. It has a history file dating back to 1991, when it was only 3 years old. So you can tell that something like this has been well loved throughout its life. Something that may be a little bit left of field is Lot 80, a 1992 Saab 900S Aero, which I think is a phenomenally good-looking car. I mentioned it again in the podcast with Tim earlier that right behind the camera is a Saab 99 GL, 1984, and we'll get to that car later. But we had 3 classic Saabs, proper Saabs, as maybe Saab people will call them, before General Motors came in. But we had 4 Saabs overall, if we include a 9.3 Estate that we had as well. But this particular 900S Aero Turbo is a heck of a performance car. It's a 1992 car. It's in red. It has those fabulous 3-spoke alloy wheels. Second car we've done today with 3-spoke alloys, and it's got the grey lower half to the car. So it's such a stylistic statement, that car. It is a car that tells you it's a classic car, that tells you it's something different right from the outset. So if you like that kind of vibe, then a Saab is a really good choice because it doesn't look like any modern cars. Yet at the same time, all classic Saabs were engineered probably better than any other car in the world. They are safe, they are very rigid. Yes, they don't have airbags or anything like that, but a Saab 900 has load paths, it has side impact protection, it has crumple zones. Compared to many other classic cars, one of these would be the safe choice, would be the sensible choice for a family. And being a Saab 900 with a hatchback, there's so much luggage space in it, more than you would get in the vast majority of modern cars. And so if you want to transport around a family, this is a great choice. Sure, this one is a 3-door car, which means it's maybe a little bit more difficult to get into the back, but regardless, just fold the front seats forward and you'll be absolutely golden. But not only are these Saabs sensible, safe, stylish, but they also go like the clappers. I couldn't tell you how much power these late 900 turbos actually made, but this one, of course, it's sold for £12,075. But it had quite a bit of work carried out by Abbott Racing in 2006, and they modified the valves, the intake and exhaust throats, so I assume they ported it, therefore. They machined and reconditioned the cylinder heads, supplied and fitted with a limited slip differential. Tells you it's got a bit of power if it needs an LSD to keep it in a straight line. And it has a full stainless exhaust, it has a charge cooler, new fuel pressure regulator, should I say, and a dump valve and a sports air filter. It'll probably make brilliant whooshy noises as well. I've not heard this, I've not driven it, so I can't say, but I would assume by that spec list, it's going to make some good turbo noises, this. But that performance that it gets you, this will show up many a modern car in a straight line. And so the added safety, shall we say, that having extra power brings really shows itself with this Saab 900. Stylish, safe, well built, very comfortable, safe handling as well. These Saabs understeer safely, and they don't do anything stupid. They are not the most sophisticated suspension-wise, but what Saab's engineers in Trollhättan did was to make them so competent and so very safe. And so with that extra power, that's fantastic. And the other thing is that this car presents incredibly nicely. It looks like a car with half the mileage, if not less than that, because this thing has done 145,000 miles. The 99 behind the door's done 140,000 as well. And while we do have an unsold lot from this auction, a beige Saab 99, again, we'll get to it, that car has many less miles. But the higher mileage examples do not show themselves up. Saab built these cars for quality motoring, and it really shows when you put a high mileage Saab versus a high mileage virtually anything else of its era. And so don't be afraid of pouring the miles on something like that. Next, we have something that is still an incredibly popular daily mode of transport, not only for classic car enthusiasts in the UK, but also across countries like France, for example. We see, if you go to France now, you will see dozens and dozens and dozens of Peugeot 205s, still in faithful use, still providing their owners with sterling service 30, 40 years after they're originally produced. The car we have here might be the sweet spot in the 205 range, however. It was lot 41, and it was a 1988 Peugeot 205 1.6 GTI. And the 1.9 GTI has a few extra features. It has different wheels, half leather seats, and of course it has the greater capacity. It has 130 brake horsepower, might be 140 even. I can't remember now. My brain, I'm getting full-on brain fog here already. But, it doesn't have the extra power, this 1.6, but the great thing about it being a 1.6 is that I assume it will not have power steering. And that makes such a difference when you're using a car like this, something that is small, light, nimble. You don't need power steering. Certainly not for anyone who would be looking to daily a classic car today. You just don't need the power steering, and the lack of power steering gives so much better feel. When I first drove a 1.9 GTI Peugeot 205, I was a little bit disappointed. Not because there was fundamentally anything wrong with the car, but because it felt a little bit front heavy, but that's expected when you've got a large capacity engine in the front of a small car. But the steering was so over-assisted that I didn't get the feedback I really wanted from it. One of these smaller capacity GTIs, however, will have that extra feedback through it. So it makes a huge difference to the driving dynamics. And having the full cloth seats means it won't be cold in the winter and it won't be hot in the summer, the interior. So, all these things come together. It's a lovely red example, F-Reg. As I said, I do prefer the 1.6s, but that also means that it's worth a little bit less than the 1.9. So for a small car from the 1980s, it's still quite expensive. £10,500 this car went for at auction. Totally understandable price. The 205 GTI is held up as the bastion. It's held up as the greatest hot hatch of all time for a very, very good reason. So a price like that is absolutely understandable. However, if you were to take that plunge and spend £10,500, you are getting, as I said, one of the greatest hot hatches of all time. And it managed to get that status through a number of different avenues. First of all, it was very stylish. You wouldn't mistake a 205 for anything other than a Peugeot, and this was in Peugeot's golden era of styling. It's very French in a way, but it's incredibly chic, which I suppose lends it to being French, I would suppose. They also have pedigree. The 205 Turbo 16 may have been a silhouette racer. It wasn't really a 205, but that gave the car pedigree. It gave it a cool factor that many of the hot hatches of the 1980s lacked, and so people wanted to be seen in a 205. Third of all, they have so much ability. They have that brilliant XU engine up front, which will go on forever, as we'll come to in a second, but provides brilliant power output. It's just over 100 brake horsepower, I believe, a 1.6, maybe 105 rings a bell. But regardless, it doesn't matter. That's why I've not done the research into it. It's all about how it makes you feel. And a 205 1.6 GTI has plenty of pace. Plenty of pace. And it has torsion beam, torsion bar, I believe, actually, rear suspension, struts up front, so it's very delicate to drive. It has a great ride handling compromise as well, as many classic French cars do. But our final point 4 of why the 205 GTI is a great hot hatch, and still is today, is its dependability. So I mentioned that a lot of people still use 205s in France to this day. They are still used all over France as everyday cars, because the French are a little bit less throwaway in their nature than we British are. They're more than willing to keep hold of an older car. They're not so bothered about the image of having a newer car as maybe we are in Britain, for example. And so this would be a great choice for anyone looking for that 80s aesthetic. But yeah, dependability. They go on forever, they do huge mileages. Some of the plastic components in them are not known for the highest of quality, but in terms of the bits that keep the car moving, keep the car turning, and keep the car stopping, 205s are bulletproof. This particular example has done 118,000 miles. Of course, it comes with that brilliant electric sunroof that many 205s do. And it's just, again, a lovely example. Now, we've been over, 3 relatively high-value cars there. At least I would suggest them to be quite high-value cars. But we'll skip over the Jaguar XJS, which I think is a point I'm now certainly labouring across these podcasts, and come down to some more affordable, some maybe more attainable classic daily cars. So it came in quite late in the day, so I didn't get the chance to have a good look around this, but we had a 1981 Mark I Ford Fiesta Bravo. Now, I've never heard of the Bravo before. I think it might have been a special edition, a limited edition of some kind, but it's 1100cc, little Kent engine as they were, and the Mark I Fiesta has so much more ability than many people give it credit for. So I used to own, up until a couple of months ago, a little Austin Metro, 1987 Metro 1.3L, and it was a bonny little thing. I drove it everywhere at all times, and it was more than totally usable. Nice, big capacity A-series engine meant it had plenty of torque, and the hydrogas suspension was nice and wafty as well, so you weren't being clattered about. Maybe the refinement of the body shell wasn't quite as high as some more modern cars, but the Mark I Fiesta is a very refined car. It has a very nice driving position. It's an easy car to get on with. And they're pretty reliable as well. Those good old Kent engines were used in Fords all the way through to 2004. So you could say that the power unit of this Mark I Fiesta, it's a 43-year-old car, barring the carburettor atop it. It's still a relatively modern engine, even if it launched all the way back in 1959. But that's the proof of good engineering, that it needn't go to waste. It needn't needlessly be abandoned at some point during the years. It can keep motoring for many, many decades. So this Mark I Fiesta is two-tone. It's got brilliant 4-spoke RS alloy wheels, and again, it just presents very nicely. This particular car has an indicated 47,000 miles on it, and it's sold for £7,245. I think that's a very impressive price for a Mark I Fiesta at this point. Certainly one that isn't an XR2 anyway. That is a very impressive price. So again, it might be out of the reach of some people, but if you can get yourselves into one of these, they're so much more capable than many people give them credit for. Not because they don't rate them, but because they see them as an old car, coming up to its 50th birthday, the Mark I Fiesta now. But drive one of these in the modern world, and not only do you get that connection to the road that old cars bring, but you also get very compact size. It's TARDIS-like inside a Mark I Fiesta. You get huge amounts of interior space with not very much exterior space. So if you live in a city, for example, and you need a car still to get around, then something compact, a little super mini like a Mark I Fiesta, or maybe the 205 that we've just been through, might be a great choice. And also, you get this brilliant glass house that surrounds you. There's a lot to be said for classic motoring. There are a lot of features with older cars that you just don't get in many more modern cars. So moving down a little bit again, And we see a few quite interesting cars crop up, including a pair of L322 Range Rovers. This was the kind of BMW and Ford era of Range Rover, built between 2002 and 2012, of course. We had a TD V8 example and a petrol V8 example, a very early one, 2002, on a 52 plate. And the diesel one sold for £5,750. The petrol one went for £4,830. Now, these are relatively modern cars, but they stand up today as possibly the high point of the Range Rover as a marque. Certainly, they're a car that many motoring journalists still look at today as a fantastic choice for just everyday usable cars. They're not really talked about as classics, but they're now 22 years old. So they're certainly approaching that point. They're closer to being registered as historic vehicles and being exempt from tax and MOT than they are to being brand new now, some of the early ones. So they're interesting to look at and say you can get all this luxury, the brilliant presence of a Range Rover, etc., for less than £5,000. It's quite remarkable that these things still exist. Still, we're going to stick with something a little bit modern-ish now and go to the late 90s and to a 986 Porsche Boxster. We had a silver over black, maybe a boring spec, but 1988 2.5-litre Boxster, virtually as the car was launched. This one is an automatic. I would personally prefer the manual, but that's just me. This car sold for £4,600. Now, these first-generation Boxsters have never been worth a lot of money. They're going through that same spell that the old Porsche 924 did decades ago, where they are the affordable Porsche. Anyone can afford to get into an original Boxster. Sure, it might cost a little bit to upkeep, what with its mid-engine layout, flat-six engine, etc., but that comes with the territory when you buy a Porsche. And if you're only paying £4,600 for it, put a few grand aside. Put a few grand aside to spend on improving it, in doing some preventative maintenance over the next few years, and I'm sure it will see you very, very happy indeed. This example has less than 79,000 miles on it, and it, again, presents very, very well. That runny egg headlamp era of Porsche is starting to appreciate now. People are starting to realise that, actually, though they're not traditional, they do look quite good, these things. So it's an interesting thing to look at and say, oh, actually, you could get a heck of a lot of car for less than £5,000. Something like a Boxster still blows many modern, smaller sports cars out of the water. And if you don't need those back seats, then why not drive it every day? I think it would be a fantastic choice to drive every day. I've looked at cheap Boxsters a number of times and I've weaned myself off them because it could potentially be dangerous. But here it is. This one, lot 45, went through in our December auction. Total bargain. We then come to a no reserve car. We come to the little Saab 99 that I'm looking at now, just behind the camera here. It's a bonny little thing. I drove this particular example, so I can tell you that it drove really nicely. Again, it's safe. That's what Saabs are. And this one doesn't have that glittering performance of a later 900 Turbo, or maybe quite the refinement of it. But for a car designed in the late 1960s, you know, if someone came totally blind into our facility here, and I covered up this Saab 99, took them out for a drive in it, they didn't know what it was, I'm sure they would tell me it felt like a car from the 1990s or even the 2000s. Because cars have not progressed anywhere near as much as you think they might have done. Certainly in some fields, outright safety, emissions, absolutely, totally understandable, and the tech, of course, on modern cars is just unparalleled. But there is a lot to be said still for these older cars that just give you that more compact size, that better visibility, that extra connection with the road. I've said it all before, and I'll say it again, but this particular Saab 99 GL sold for £4,600. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it has 139,000 miles on it, so that is quite high mileage, but it's not for a Saab. Saabs can do this. Saabs were engineered for this. So it's a very interesting car to look at because we have its twin here as well. I'll scroll down to find it here. Oh, here it is. So that white car that is just behind the camera is a 1984 car. And virtually alongside it, we have another Saab 99. We have a 1983 example. It's beige, very period colour, proper hearing aid. But it has a lovely matching velour interior as well. It presents very nicely, this one. And this car only has 60,000 miles. So it's far lower mileage than the white one that we had in. The white one sold for £4,600, as I said, but the beige car, which we still have with us, was estimated between 5,000 and 6,000. I was maybe a little bit surprised that this car didn't go in the auction. But, you know, if you've got two of them on sale next to each other, people are maybe going to go for the lower value one. It's understandable why. But this particular car, with only 60,000 miles on it, there's a deal to be done. There is absolutely a deal to be done. So if you'd like the look of this little Saab 99, then do get in touch with us. Go to the website, have a look at the pictures of it, because it is still available. With such low mileage, I've not driven this particular car. It has a full year's MOT. As I said, it presents very nicely. Its side rubbing strips are not fitted to the car, but they are provided in the boot. So it's all present and correct. Y registered. Saab 99s are very, very capable cars. So we've talked a little bit about super minis. We've talked about some of the smaller cars you can get, and we have one more of those here. Again, it was a no reserve car, and it sold for £4,140, a 2001 Citroen Saxo VTR. So it's not the full fat VTS, it doesn't have the 16 valve cylinder head, but still, the Saxo is still such a usable car. Right up until 10 years ago, there or thereabouts, people were still using them as everyday cars. Now they're starting to fade away slightly, but a Saxo, a 106, etc., they are up and coming classic cars. People of my age, people in their mid-20s, we remember these cars. They were a little bit out of date by the time I turned 17, but they're a car that a lot of people had access to, and so these are only going one way in terms of value. And for £4,100, you get a really nicely presenting 2001 51 plate Saxo VTR mini hot hatch. Just a lovely little thing again. We'll move on from the super minis now because we're starting to labour the point. And big family cars. What can we get in terms of big family cars that can nice and relatively safely and reliably take your family around? And again, as a no reserve car sold for £4,025, we have a 1990 Ford Granada Gear 4x4. 2.9 litre Cologne V6, so it may drink a little bit of fuel, but you're spending £4,000 on the car. Save a little bit of money for the fuel. It doesn't matter, you get that lovely V6 soundtrack from its Cologne engine. And a Ford Granada, it's a big old hunk of car. If you park it next to many modern saloon cars, however, it will look quite small. But inside, it has all that space, a big, full-size executive car back in the late 80s, early 1990s. It has four-wheel drive, so it will help get you out of maybe some sticky situations. This car has a manual gearbox. I believe all the 4x4s actually had manual gearboxes, but I've driven this car again. Very sweet gear change on it. It just performs so well. And I took that car out expecting to quite enjoy it, but I didn't expect it to feel so refined. For this brilliantly practical car that does look a little bit dated now. It's nearly 35 years old, but you get that late 80s style with something like this. If you're hunting for classic cars, that's a whole part of the fun, isn't it? But this can transport the entire family around. Only had 3 former owners, 34 years old, 3 former owners. It's just nothing really, is it? How many miles did it have? Let's just click on the listing and have a look. 74,000 miles is how many it had. Looked to me to be sitting a little bit low on its rear axle as it came into our halls here, but it still presents very, very nicely. With a little bit of extra work, something like this can look really, really smart. Beautiful velour seats as well, so it's not getting cold in the winter and hot in the summer like leather so often can. And just refined. So refined. I'd have taken that car to the south of France because it was just comfortable and refined. And I think a lot of manufacturers have forgotten just how good comfort is. It's an underrated feature in modern cars as we've moved towards more sporting offerings. So we'll talk about another two sports cars now, and we had a 1.9 litre, so only 4 cylinders, but a 1.9 16-valve BMW Z3. The Z3 is a car that'll be celebrating its 30th anniversary in 2025, and it's a car that I feel a lot of people have ignored unfairly for too long. Sure, this one doesn't have the requisite 6 cylinders, but that means it's a little bit more frugal. It also means the engine sits further back in the engine bay, so I think you could technically class one of these as mid-engined. This car, 2 former owners, 67,000 miles. It's dating from 1997, silver over red leather. And who doesn't love red leather? Lovely little 5-spoke alloy wheels. Northern Irish registration on this one, interestingly. But the Z3 was not the most sophisticated of cars when it was launched in 1995. It had the rear axle, for example, of the compact 3 Series, which itself had the rear axle of the old E30 3 Series. The car that everybody still praises to the ends of the earth today for its delicacy on the road. They're not quite the most secure of cars, but the E30s just dance along the roads. They're such delicate cars to drive, and something like this Z3 is a really affordable way into that ecosystem, because E30s now are proper bona fide classic cars. They're worth a bit of money. Z3, £3,500 this car went for. $3,500 for a 2-seat BMW Roadster, 16-valve engine with only 67,000 miles. It is an absolute bargain, this car. And it's just remarkable that you still get cars in this kind of condition, for this kind of price. And this car's a manual as well. It just ticks all the boxes except that one marked straight 6. But the 4-cylinder has its own advantages, as I mentioned. But yeah, it's interesting. I know a friend of mine who would quite like a Z3. Maybe he should have taken some notice of this one and maybe bid it up a little bit higher than 3,500. But another one, if you want to go a little bit more classic than the Z3, 30 years old in 2025, of course, so it's already very much a classic car in its own right, but you can have a little Porsche 924. This is a 924S, which means it does have the Porsche engine. It's not the old Volkswagen or Audi engine, actually. We should describe it of the original. Deregistered, 1987. This was a no-reserve car, 53,000 miles, manual gearbox, of course. It has the... I'm going to describe them as teledial wheels, so that's very much an Alfa Romeo, turn of phrase. It has its original dashboard, which is a little bit more kind of chocolate boxy than the later one of the 944S that we mentioned earlier, but it's red, presents very well, narrow body, £3,450 for a Porsche with a proper Porsche engine. That will not cost you a heck of a lot to maintain. It will probably be more affordable to maintain than the Boxster. And because it is that little bit older, it's that generation, or even 2 generations older, really, car dating from the early 70s, in terms of its design, of course, launched in 76. They have such style to them, such a retro style. Pop-up headlamps. You can't argue with pop-up headlamps. Another little family car we have, and the one that will round us off today, is a 1992 Citroen BX 16 TXD. Diesel Citroen, anything French and diesel from the 80s and 90s will go to the end of the earth. We've talked about the 205s before. Many of the surviving 205s are the diesel ones. They will do moon mileages, and indeed this Citroen BX has 171,000 miles. But it doesn't look like it, it doesn't feel like it, and it's now 32 years old, coming up to its 33rd birthday even, and this car sold for £2,600. Now, not only do you get a very practical estate car, something you can take all the family in, you get the economy of that diesel engine up front, you get the longevity of that diesel engine up front, but you also get some brilliant Giugiaro styling. Sorry, not Cheshire. I don't know why I just said that. Because, of course, the Citroen BX was Bertoni and Marcello Gandini. I don't know where I get it from sometimes, but fantastic Gandini styling with this Citroen BX. And, of course, Gandini also styled cars like the Lamborghini Miura and the Fiat X19, and they also do a couple of BMWs as well. yeah, some incredible cars that Marcello Gandini styled. Unfortunately, passed away quite recently. But you get that fantastic style. You get the practicality. You get the longevity as well. And you get Citroen hydrogen pneumatics, which you do not need to be scared of. People are far more scared than they really should be of the hydrogen pneumatics. But that means that you get excellent braking performance. It means you get almost an unparalleled ride handling compromise, one of the softest suspensions in the world, and of course you have a lever in the middle of the car, so you can raise it and lower it just to impress your passengers. And what's cooler than having a float on fluid Citroen? What a cool thing. But anyway, £2,600 can get you such a bargain. There are some incredible bargains out there. The value for money that you can still get in the classic car market in Great Britain. In many other countries, these cars are worth a lot more money. Many European countries, for example, these cars are worth more. But for whatever reason in the UK, we can still get them for relatively affordable prices. So I hope you enjoyed that little rundown today of some of the cars that went through our December auction for what I think were, pretty reasonable prices. Some of them certainly higher end. We had that Range Rover, the Porsche 944 at the beginning. We glossed over the XJSs totally because I will be labouring that point. But lower down the range, some of our no reserve cars are some incredible bargains for cars that you can absolutely drive every day. Because I feel one of the biggest barriers to classic car ownership is storage and insurance. And to have multiple cars, it takes up a lot of space. Space is at a premium. Not everybody has the space to be able to do so. But if you get away with driving a classic every day, buy a nice, well-maintained, reliable classic car, not only will it be fantastically cool, fun to drive, but should see you well too. It shouldn't cost all that much money to maintain. And keep an eye on our website to see some of the cars that are coming in for our February auction that may also be very dailyable classic car bargains.